I'm here at Denver Startup Week here in Denver, Colorado. I'm getting ready to be on a panel for diversity in storytelling. We have a panel of 5 amazing individuals that are really going to be sharing some amazing, powerful knowledge and information about how to tell a great story, how to tell stories, and how to be diverse in your marketing of storytelling. And it's going to be a great panel. I hope you stick through the whole thing. It's a little bit long, but it's going to be well worth the watch. So, welcome to Around the Block Talk, marketing advice that works.
It is time to get started. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I say welcome 3 times because we are so excited to have you at Startup Week and even more excited to have you at Diversity in Storytelling. My name is Osa and I will be your moderator for today. Before we get going with these amazing storytellers, I want to bring 2 quick things to our attention. The first is we would love to thank all of our sponsors. Without sponsors, Startup Week could not be possible. If we have any in the crowd, could you please raise your hand? We got one. The others are probably either shy or modest. But again, thank you so much to our sponsors. Number 2, this year with Startup Week, I want to say every year, but this year in particular, we are really focusing on the combination of diversity, inclusion, and equity. We don't care where you're from, what you look like, the color of your skin, whatever your gender identity or expression is. We want to say that you are welcomed here, and we are excited to be imparting this knowledge, hopefully getting you inspired to go out and change the world. And we ask that after you leave this place and you go to other sessions, that you are echoing those same sentiments. And you don't have to be a brand ambassador like I am, but make sure that you're being mindful of your words and the actions that you were taking. Cool. So, let's hop into these amazing storytellers. First and foremost, we have Brett Rendell. Brett Rendell. Brett is a story-driven copywriter for global impact thought leaders and founders. He has also worked remotely for 2 Austin-based startups, which include Empowering 1 Billion Women by 2020 and Storytelling for Entrepreneurs. Brett is also a yoga musician, fiction writer, and constant traveler. Real Renaissance man. Up next, we have Carlos Mireles. Carlos is bilingual. He is a creative designer by heart who founded Blu Bambu Design to help empower business owners, entrepreneurs, to tell their stories with effective marketing, high-quality multimedia content. And this is actually a really cool tidbit about Carlos. Since the age of 12, I should say the tender age of 12, he's been sending his sketches to major logos like Coca-Cola, Vans, and Nike, hoping that some way, somehow, they would one day discover his unwavering passion. Next up, we have Tristan Dimery. Tristan is a food blogger, content creator, and owner of Dimery Brand Plus Concept, where she uses photography, brand activation, creative strategy to bring stories to life. Tristan's appreciation for food in combination with her impeccable style has enabled her to host renowned events all over the city and beyond. And what Tristan also won't tell you is that she is the life of the party, and if you ever get her on the dance floor, it is going to be very, very hard to get her off. Finally, we have Kadri Bennett, not finally, but Kadri Bennett. Kadri is the creative director, producer, and co-founder of Lifted Film and Music. Kadri began her career, professional life, as a successful publisher in Estonia, and she left it all behind for her amazing husband and the company that they founded in 2008, while navigating. Look, I got you guys. I'm a storyteller too. While trying to navigate the Miami entertainment scene, in 2010 they moved to Colorado, and 6 years later, their company had their first full-feature documentary production that took them around the world, co-producing a film that explores how prominent musical artists express their vision. Finally, we have Brenton Way. Brenton uses the power of words and performance to cultivate humanity. He is a first-generation essayist, an award-winning creative polymath, you'll have to ask him about that afterwards, TEDx organizer, and an event imagineer. Informed by travel to nearly 70 nations, Brenton's work blends narrative, philosophy, and history to examine the struggle and beauty of the human experience. Oh, my gosh. As I said, we have some amazing, amazing speakers, and all of you are in for this great treat. Are we ready?
Yeah.
I love it, I love it. Keep giving me the energy. So, our very first question, we'll start off with Tristan. When did you first realize how powerful stories could be?
That is a great question. I don't know, I feel like stories are everywhere. My mother is a gourmet chef. As I said, I'm a food blogger. So I think that's one great way to share stories and culture. So I think learning that, being from New York originally, you kind of get that sense of it. It's kind of your introduction. So I would say starting off with food.
For me, it was basically when I first came to the States 14 years ago, and I first realized that, of course I knew that everybody doesn't have the same narrative in life, but really realizing how different we all are. So it's supposed to be a 3-month short trip. I'm still here, and I'm still discovering this great nation.
My standard nerdy book response is just from reading Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings when I was little. But then in regards to human storytelling, my parents took us to the Amazon in Venezuela when I was 11 back in the 90s, and just cracking my brain open into a completely different culture and experience at such a young age, I think framed how I viewed humanity from that point on. So that was a big story shift for me when I was younger.
For me, I come from an African family, so stories are imbued within you from a very young age, sometimes to the point where you actually can't get away from them. I'd ask my dad when I was young, oh, can I go buy a box of cookies at the grocery store? And he'd be like, you know, son, when I was a young boy in the northern jungles in Congo, I was like, okay, Dad, it's okay. I've grown up with stories, and I think they're just a language of transmitting potent emotions. So that was me.
Well, for me, it started when my father was a volunteer firefighter, and in making friends at the fire department, we would go and do different excursions. And one summer, I was 9 years old, we went camping with some fellow firefighters and their families. And one of the firefighters had his mother there, and she was 76 at the time. And I could not get away from her. I would always want to be at her side, because whenever she was cooking or getting the fire going or anything on campsite, she would always tell the most amazing stories. And I learned that from her in the sense of appreciation of a good story. And she had all these wonderful stories of when she was little, remembering World War II, Vietnam, and then all these cultural stories that she had, because she had traveled around the world. So camping, my 9th grade year, was the time that let me realize how powerful a story is when it's told well.
So I think oftentimes we're trying to find ways to bring stories into corporations, and the two seem to be siloed, especially creativity in the corporate world. And so we're trying to figure out how to merge those two things. And so the next question is, what does diversity in business and brand storytelling mean to you, and why is it beneficial now?
That's a great question. I don't think that we've had an influx of people of color in this nation. I think there have been people of color in this nation since the beginning. And now the corporate world is starting to acknowledge that, mostly because of money, mostly because they know that there's a profit margin to be expunged out of these markets. But now it's becoming more relative because of that, of market share, of understanding that there is a potential in these communities. So I think that it's very important that we've gotten to that point that we're acknowledging it. Even though we have a ways to go, there is definitely an opening of the door, if you will, to really bringing in stories that have always been there. But now it's these corporate and mostly white-driven corporations that are now understanding that they should probably open up their eye a little bit more, even though contextually they may not understand culturally, which is hopefully another part that we'll dive into this discussion. But it's a good thing that we're moving into that world, even though it's barely beginning. And it's important because we need to tell the stories of people that we're trying to market to.
I think for me it's very simple. It boils down to the fact that the ability for someone to resonate with a story is entirely correlated with their ability to see themselves in the narrative. If someone can't see themselves in a story, then it's not going to move them. And so we've gotten to the point similar, piggybacking off of Carlos, where from an economic perspective, people of color and people of just different, diverse and ideological backgrounds have gotten more market share and more influence in terms of just having economic power. And so in this situation, we see it here in Denver all the time. A lot of the cultural institutions for many decades have just relied on a largely older and white and affluent base to support them and to fund their different initiatives. But now they're seeing that those people are kind of aging out of the market and they're not being replaced. They're being replaced by people who look like all of you, who are of different backgrounds, come from different parts of the world, different parts of the country, and so they're realizing that their stories have to reflect that. And so we're seeing that in culture and movies, we're seeing that in advertisements, where I was actually having a conversation with a good friend of mine where I was like, if you look at an ad now, let's say for clothing, for example, clothing is a great example. The general model that you see now is very usually mixed race. And it's not just like, the classic thin blonde. And so we're even seeing in like what it means to be an avatar in brands is changing visually. And that's a representation of companies understanding that it is very much in the interest of their bottom line to make those changes. And I think that's also having a powerful cultural impact.
I agree with both of them. So I'm a big fan of vision and like personal dreams of moving towards something. And I think stories are a huge part of narrative of how you can envision yourself for the future. So building off what they both said, when you see in modern culture and modern business or previous culture and previous business, a certain archetype of what can be possible or what is represented as normal, it creates more of a linear dream of what can happen. And now that that dream is spreading out with different narratives and different stories, more people can apply that to their lives and say, oh, I want to see myself as a CEO of a corporation or in the C-suite here or C-suite there. So I think having more diverse and inclusive stories and representation of success with people of different backgrounds and human experiences opens up various pathways for envisioning a dream of different types of people's reality.
So maybe I would just add here that as a Denver Startup Week, I might assume that a lot of you are small business owners, and we all start out with a big dream, and we might want to also end up influencing masses. But I think it's always really important to start with your own experience, and not with your own, but really specific experience, really specific idea and solution. And it's best to throw that from your own experience and narrative and life, and then through that, I think it's easier to find a core group of people who can relate to that. So my message is that don't be afraid to tell your specific story, that there will always be somebody out there who can relate and who can draw inspiration from it, or your product or your idea, your blog might be solution or help for their life, and you can grow from there.
Piggybacking off of you, I think we all, we can talk about color or orientation and all that stuff, but we all have different things that we relate to just in our general lives, whether that's family or your only child. So I think just diving deeper and not just surface level of like, oh, this room looks like this, right? We all wear the same clothes. It might be shaped differently. Something might resonate a little bit differently with us. So that has been my biggest takeaway of like, I live in Denver. In general, we can say, yeah, this is a white city or this and that, but people have individual stories and other levels they can resonate with.
Beautiful, beautiful. So we have a variety of different storytellers here, And what makes all of you different isn't just your story, but it's the medium in which you tell your story with. And so we'd love to know about what does your storytelling process look like? And what are some tangible takeaways that people in the audience can be able to add to their toolbox? And let's start from the middle.
Sneaky. Cool. So work-wise, I work mainly with female founders and diversity impact leaders. I've been working with an organization called Empowering a Billion Women by 2020 for 7 years, and another one called Storytelling for Entrepreneurs. So I've been working with a lot of super badass global thought leaders. I've been working with diversity and inclusion specialists for the last year, and which I just love because the more I work with each type of person, I get to learn a ton about that subject. So the question is like, what's an actionable takeaway?
And also to your process for storytelling.
Sure. So I do a lot of brand storytelling work, like copy for people's website or the offerings that they portray, or their kind of like tight crystallized message, or how they come to the world. So personally, what I do, which is kind of a fusion of these two things, is with Storytelling for Entrepreneurs, we do this kind of deep history process, which is like a long 3-hour interview with someone, which I encourage people to do themselves, because I think we're not fully aware of our own story until we really dig deep into like the chapters and sections of our life. And I tell every entrepreneur or founder I work with that there's usually like 1 or 2 lines that are like the gem of your life that is super hyper connected that you would end up using in like your story or your about page. I'll give a quick example. Dr. Nika White is this amazing diversity inclusion leader that I've been working with, and insane accolades, worked with like 80 corporations, and she just couldn't find like a thing to connect with. And so I interviewed her for 3 hours, and it turned out her county was the last county in the States to celebrate Martin Luther King Day. She's from South Carolina, and she finally got like a group of game changers together, and they organized this MLK Dream Day event. It was the last county in the States to recognize it, and Martin Luther King's daughter heard about it, flew out and spoke at it. So I was like, we're putting that as a line in your bio, and it like makes her accolades pop more because it's an authentic piece of her story that's powerful and represents the work she's doing. So I'm all about like huge deep dive into your story, the story of your client, the story of your customers, and finding that one like story gem to accent your narrative.
So, my husband and I, we have told many widely different stories. So, and we do it through videography, film, music, and I would have to say that as every story is different, every process has been slightly different too. In ideal, we would want to spend a lot of time on pre-production, in a sense like really get to know your client. If it's a client you're working with, if it's yourself, you would have to tell probably your story to somebody else to truly like hear it back through somebody else. So when you hear yourself telling it to somebody, it helps you to really reflect what are you trying to say. And but it doesn't happen like that in the real world, in all the time. Like when we filmed that documentary, we kind of jumped in. We got a yes from artist one day, and we were shooting the next day. So there was no pre-production. And with the feature film, we started with one script, and in the editing process, it ended up being something totally different. So I think you have to have that flexibility. No matter what story you're telling, sometimes you just have to start telling it. And that's the way to get started.
My medium has changed. I started with graphic design, branding, marketing, and then I moved over to photography, and now I do my own events. For me, it's really about being face-to-face with my audience, my friends, and good energy. And with taking photos, I like to do a lot of candids and portraits, like in the moment. So like you said, that flexibility to just, hey, this is a shot right here. You know, we're dancing, we're having fun, or we're eating. You got to kind of be on your toes a little bit. So the process is different for each, project, I would say.
Okay, that was a big loaded question. But everyone, if you take what everyone has said so far, and I know he's going to say something amazing as well, It actually, you want to do all of this, okay? I used to just kind of like, let me jump in, let me just record, and I'm from a video world. I do web, graphic design. I started with graphic design, and now I've moved into copy just because it's helped me figure out what I want to say. But now I've gone into a little bit more structure. My process is that I figure out the goal, I figure out the message, and I understand the demographic of who I'm trying to tell. And not that you make up stories to fit that, but you want to know where you're headed, right? And the way I begin a story is a 3-part story. I start with the beginning, the middle, and the end, right? And I found it to be very refreshing, whether it's I'm telling a live story, whether you're telling an Instagram story, or you're making a video, or even putting content on a web page or a blog. I try to section it out by piece into 3 sections, right? And I try to put it out into what is the final end of that story. And it does work sometimes and it does change depending on the situation, but you do want to get some of that pre-production, or I call it pre-development if you're not doing a video, but if you're doing video, pre-production phase where you're getting your information, you're getting the story. If you're going to be telling a story of one of your clients, hint, hint, your business, if you're trying to tell your story is not necessarily your story of your business, but the story of your clients that you're helping, okay? So when you're trying to tell a story, I try to get the details and really filter it down into the key pieces that I want to talk about. And then I go into maybe storyboarding it. So I'll get some little post-it notes, and I'll draw in there, even though my hand drawing skills has gotten really bad. I will get in there and just draw out the points, right? So that way I either know whether it's I'm using pictures or video or even words, I know where I can start building my story. And then I go into production, right? And that's where I'm filming it, or I'm taking the photos, or I'm getting my assets, or I'm writing my details. And then I go into post-production, where I'm piecing them together, laying it out. If it's a spread on a page or a blog, I'm laying it out. If it's photography, a story through photos, I'm putting the photos in order, cropping them, getting them ready. If it's video, I'm getting my pieces filmed. So like, for example, today we're filming this panel. So we're going to be breaking up these cameras. We got different angles. After this, you're going to see me filming a little intro and a little outro, and then I'm going to put them together, and we're going to edit them back in the studio. So I try to do that as part of my process. What was the other part of the question?
The process and then specific takeaways.
Oh, and the specific takeaway. You have a goal of telling a story, okay? You need to find out what the goal of that story is, okay? If you have a client that whatever you've helped them with has created some amazing results, don't just talk about how you created amazing results, but talk about why they occurred. Who was the person? Your client? Who was the audience that you were trying to reach? And break it down and look at it from that perspective, and you'll get a lot from your storytelling. Sometimes just creating a story. I've done documentary work where you just jump into filming and stuff. And that's okay in a documentary because then you're going to sift through the content and figure out the story. But most of the time as business owners, you don't have that luxury, okay? You have specific hours to create content or your marketing and sit and structure it and get your points down and then build it out. Don't go flying by the seat of your pants unless you're an experienced storyteller.
Fly by the seat of your pants. So for me, I I play in 2 different worlds. So on the one hand, I play in the arts. This year, the Denver Center, right there, launched a year-long fellowship for the first time in their history for 4 of the highest potential playwrights in Colorado. And so I'm one of their inaugural fellows, working on a piece over there. And also, I work a lot with different city organizations. So speaking of diversity and equity, I wrote a poem for the city of Denver called Multiplicity, which is actually the official poem of diversity and equity of the city of Denver. And so I play in the arts world, and simultaneously I've worked with nonprofits and social impact organizations all over the world to tell their story in everywhere from advocating to clean water, to reducing recidivism, to working with child soldiers in Central Africa or other places like that. And so for me, when I think about my process, I really think about this quote that I really love from one of my favorite yogic philosophers, who always says that your heart is the light, so don't cover it up with your mind. And so when I'm so often interacting with entrepreneurs or organizations, they always come to me and they're like, oh, how do we get people to give us money? How do we get people to come to our event? And I'm like, you're thinking about it in the entire backwards way. It's not about how do you get somebody to do something, it's just how do you give them an experience that's going to be compelling to them. And if you create an experience that's compelling for people, they're going to come and they're going to support you. One way or another. It doesn't always have to be money or time in whatever way is meaningful to them. And so when I think about storytelling, I think about how do we get to that heart place where you're not thinking about what you should be saying, but you're thinking about what you need to be saying, what you need to communicate to the world. And so often, like similar to what Brett was saying, what Carlos was saying, we get caught up in, well, this is how so-and-so does it. This is how this bigger nonprofit tells a story. This is how this person who's more successful than me tells their story. Well, the thing is, you're not that person, and you're not that bigger nonprofit. And so for me, when I'm working with an organization, similar to what Brett was saying, like how can you get down to the kernel of what's unique to that person, what's unique to their story, their organizational story? Because the thing that you think is, oh, just like stupid or silly or whatever, is oftentimes the thing that's actually gonna make you stand out. And so like, oftentimes I organize for TEDx and a number of other large events here in Colorado. And for me, the reason why I am in that place in a lot of these opportunities is because like I end a lot of events with different creative mediums that people are often seeing. And so when people see me doing that, things that are unique to me, they're like, oh, I want you to do that for my event. And so think about the thing that's unique to you, whether it's your background, your grandma, your love for, cooking, or for me, like Miyazaki and other anime films, like whatever's unique to you is gonna be the thing that helps you stand out. And so a specific takeaway for me is when I'm laying out a story, I always try to get down to what is the kernel. And so if I'm like, oh, I want to communicate that, clean water is an issue in this country. I'm like, well, is that the kernel? No. What's the deeper level to the point where I'm like, do I feel that sense of vibration, of emotional resonance, where I'm like, it's almost scary for me to say this out loud. That's how I know it's going to touch people.
I wanted to add something. What helped me is that I heard somebody saying about the speech that you need to make people laugh, cry, and think. And it had really helped me to apply that to a story too, that it would have those three elements. And then I wanted to share something. I love taking notes, and I see many of you have notebooks. So I'm going to use my phone for that because my husband shared this with me last night. So if you want to know the source, I would have to ask him. But he sent me a picture that says recipe. So that's a recipe for a story. It says be recreational, be educational, be conversational. Oh goodness. The S's are getting me.
Conversational.
There you go. Be inspirational, be promotional, and be entrepreneurial. Did I say that so
Yeah.
Okay. So, Ian, maybe you want to share the source with everybody? So, because it has like a lot of points under it, but for me that was like, oh, there's actually a recipe for a story.
All of the list of gotcha now, I can't remember exactly where it is.
We'll get it to you later. Cool. So there was something very, very powerful, a lot of things very powerful that were said today. But one of them was that we need to see ourselves in stories, because that's where the story really touches. And the issue with storytelling and diversity is that the world is very diverse, right? And so because of that, there have been failures when trying to tell stories. And so my question to all of you is, what are some of the biggest failures or issues that you've seen when people are trying to tell the stories of others, and how have you either overcome them or have seen other people overcome them?
Okay. Look up Kira Juice. K-I-R-A Juice. Someone's smiling back there. Have you seen that commercial? Okay. So the biggest pitfalls that you'll always have in storytelling is when you don't know who the hell you're telling a story about. Meaning, just because you're a storyteller in a specific area or specific topics. Don't presume that you could tell any story without context. The biggest blunders is when you don't take the time to learn about the people that you're trying to tell a story about. And yes, I do mean language, yes, I do mean experience, and yes, importantly, I mean cultural diversity and background, okay? If you're talking about a Jewish community, you're gonna avoid certain topics, okay? You're gonna avoid, when you're talking to a Latin American story, there's gonna be a difference between a Puerto Rican culture, Cuban culture, and Mexican culture, okay? You're gonna have a difference in certain, African cultures and languages, okay, and stories. And it does mean something. So one of the biggest pitfalls is when you start to try to tell a story about a group of people that you're trying to market to that you don't understand, okay? Unfortunately, white America has done a terrible job of really understanding that, okay? Why? Because you cannot act as if your skills are the only thing that you need to enter into storytelling of different diverse groups. Spend time with them. Share with them. You're going to find out that you have similarities in your own stories. The same thing goes for me. I was working on a documentary in Cuba, and it's about my wife and I, and it's called A Cuban Love Story. Did you know I had to learn a lot about Cubans and how they talk and certain words that they use that if you say in a Mexican household, you're going to have a brawl on your hands, right? So you really need to understand in context who you're talking about. Okay, if your firm is hired, if you're hired by someone to tell a story, go learn about them, okay? One of the biggest pitfalls as an example is the Kira juice. In the 80s, they did this commercial where it's this happy-go-lucky crow going through and walking and drinking juices, and it's all this blackface, very offensive caricatures that look very Negro-ish. Okay, and it was a terrible commercial. It was a terrible story trying to talk about juice, orange juice. Okay, and you had the mammy and the slaves walking in this commercial, and they just completely failed. There's a lot of different other examples. Ink Coffee, if you know about Ink Coffee, their cute little advertisements, which were not cute, came off as very offensive and very gentrified. So really understand who you're talking about, okay? If you come from a white culture, it's not a big deal to go learn about anyone else. If you're from a person of color culture, right, which is the majority on this planet, the same thing. Go learn about your brothers and sisters across the aisle before you try to tell their stories. Ask them key questions of do's and don'ts, and you'll find out that you're going to tell even better stories, and you're going to learn a thing or two about the people you're trying to tell a story about.
You know, for me, so I once had a director friend of mine who I really respect say something that really stuck with me, where he said, it's your job as a writer, especially in my sense of the playwright, it's like it's your job as a writer, especially as a writer of color, to destroy as many tropes with your work as you can. And so what I mean by that is, if you all go over to 16th Street Mall in Wine Coop, you'll see a gigantic shipping container that's been converted to a shoebox called Empathy Museum. So I have a story in that museum of when I was traveling to Thailand when I lived in Southeast Asia a number of years ago. And I have a very, very close individual in my life who was volunteering there just a couple days ago. And so she came to me and was telling about her volunteer experience. And she said that there was an older woman from the north of Colorado, from a more affluent background, who listened to my story. And my friend asked her, she was like, oh, what did you think of that story? And the woman said, you know, I really did like that story. I found it really compelling, really interesting, but I would really love to hear from someone who doesn't share my background. Like, that guy sounded like just a middle-aged white guy, and so I want to hear something different. And my friend stopped, and she was like, just give me 1 second. And she pulled up, a photo of me on Facebook, and she's like, this is the person whose story you're listening to. And so I think for me, it was a really powerful experience, because when we think about, it doesn't matter what lane you want to go in. You can talk about the lane of race, you can talk about the lane of body shape, you can talk about the lane of orientation. If you don't have experience in those communities, oftentimes you're telling the story, the biggest trap that you fall into, or can fall into, that I've seen, is you're just telling the stereotypical trope of that community, of that group, which in certain cases is perfectly fine if you're doing it in a way that is intentional and in a way that's going to communicate what you're trying to communicate. But in other situations, that can be very detrimental, and it can really backfire as a storyteller. And so what I'll end with is, on the other side of that, I remember listening to this fascinating story on NPR, and a father who lives down in Houston, who's a black man, who's talking about his young daughter. And there's some cartoon TV show where there is a black woman who's a doctor, and so she goes around saving people and doing all these amazing feats. And so the dad told a story about how he took his young daughter to the doctor's office, and an old white man comes out and he's like, "Oh, how are you doing?" The stethoscope, etc. And he leaves to go get her charts, and the daughter's very disturbed. And the dad's like, "Oh, like, sweetie, what's wrong?" And she was like, "But Dad, like, this guy's an old white guy, like, they can't be doctors." Because, like, in her mind, like, only black women were doctors. And that's what I mean by destroying tropes.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we're all digging a lot into research and immersion. I think 3 words that are super important to me with storytelling are authenticity, integrity, and research. And I think 3 of those are just vital to understanding, and actually, let's say, research with listening. Because I think a lot of times we're searching, we want to talk, we want to learn about something, when it's actually the listening and maybe even the passive immersion that is super important to learn about other people's experiences. So I think especially if you're trying to either write about a different person's experience or their narrative. I follow a lot of D&I influencers on Instagram. They're always posting great stuff. And this also works with if you're trying to influence like middle managers or C-level people on how to foster a more inclusive environment in work, or you're just trying to learn more about a culture. But it's simple things like, if I'm trying to either create something in business for this type of person or learn more about them, follow like 20 to 30 influencers or celebrities of that type of person, read books, read tons of books from people of that experience, read magazines, follow newsletters, like passively learn, research, listen. There's idiosyncrasies that we talk about, and these are the things that break tropes. And it's more for like intrigue and learning about another human. I travel a lot. I'm also like a yoga musician. I travel around the world and play music, and I always like stay. If you ever heard of a website called Couchsurfing, I've been doing that for like 10 years. So I always stay with locals, and every single time it breaks a misconception or some thought I had about a culture. And then I go with them to like local jazz bars or food spots, and like each time you learn a little bit more about being human and other types of humans, and you get closer and more connected. And I even find this just myself, like I'm also a writer. I'm in a fiction writing program, and the classic trope is the old white male writers, which is most of the canon of history. So I make it a mission to read female writers, LGBTQ writers, African American writers, people from different countries, and each time, like even just a style of language, a different experience, something opens up that is insightful and just cool, because we're humans and there's so many different narratives and experiences that I think just with integrity, immersing yourself in other cultures will open you up to better storytelling.
I would just probably add that don't be afraid to tell a story of somebody who doesn't look like you, who doesn't have the same story as you or the same narrative. Because I think this is something what we might be getting, that's the other side of trying to tell the diverse stories. We might feel that we are not the right person. But when I grew up in my home country, I really realized how unique, special, and beautiful our stories back home when I came away. And when I needed to tell that over and over again to people who ask me about my story, that's when I realized what my story is. So sometimes culture or person needs that sounding board. So just don't be afraid to take that on.
I would say work within your network. You know, it's great to go viral and everybody read your stuff or, you know, not just your content. What I've been doing with my events, it's invite only. It's kind of my core group of people. And that's been really powerful because those people, like, they promote me, you know, they support me, and they're my soundboard to more people. So I would say work within your network. And when I did not do that, my businesses were a failure because I was trying to reach whatever the masses are, but I wasn't working within the resources and the pool of people and talent that I had just right around me.
Beautiful. So we are going to open the questions up to the audience. Oh wow, we are ready to go, huh? Yeah. Bring you the mic. You can't? Go for it then.
So you talked a little bit about bringing some understanding around identifying that nugget that makes that person unique and then working further to align it to, let's say, a business goal or a broader goal of some sort. Could you speak a little bit more to that process? Because that seems kind of like mysterious to me.
Sure, definitely. Yeah, let me try to dig in my mind and give a specific example.
And that's really critical.
What's that?
And I asked that of everybody, of course.
Yeah, so getting to the kernel. Sometimes my friends never call it the kernel of truth, but it's a funny name we have for it. But getting down to that core piece and then extrapolating from there. So the best example I can give is I work with a nonprofit that started here in Denver a number of years ago called US-Brazil Connect. So they did, it was a really cool program. Essentially, it was a partnership with the Brazilian government where they would take community college students from different community colleges around the US who otherwise wouldn't have access to an international experience. And they would take them down to Brazil to learn entrepreneurship and cultural exchange. And they would work with Brazilian high schoolers who were also trying to learn entrepreneurship as applied in STEM. And so it was a really cool program. And for a time, they had these big contracts with the Brazilian government and were doing really well in terms of their fundraising. But then the Brazilian economy started getting shaky, and so they needed to do more fundraising here at home. And they brought me on to help them with different development and storytelling initiatives. And so I remember I was sitting down with the CEO and a number of people, and I was like, okay, tell me about, like, you know, I was in the program, but I was like, tell me more about the program outside of a facilitator's perspective. And so they were like, oh, you know, what we need is, or what we do is this and this, and how we look to build our base is by this and this. And I'm like, okay, essentially what you're telling me is every other educational or entrepreneurship-based nonprofit that I've ever seen in the United States. And so I'm like, when I as a consumer have the choice to give my money to 20,000 different organizations, like, why would I choose this one? And so I remember, similar to Brett, I had this interview with the CEO for a couple of hours, and it got down to the point where the CEO was talking about how when she was young, she was in high school, she got this opportunity through her local Rotary chapter to go to Brazil. And she was like, I'd never been out of the country before, definitely had never thought about going to South America. And so she told this very beautiful story of when she landed in the airport and she got on this bus. She stayed with this host family, and it was through, like, the storytelling of this aunt and this woman who had traveled all around Brazil and South America, just basically, like, investing in her time, and her world just basically exploding because she was like, wow, there are these people who, you know, they're not focused so much on, like, what their job title is or how far they're getting in their career, but they really want to build a sense of, like, love and community and empathy and, like, the food and the samba and the movement and the sensuality. And she was like, it shifted my entire perspective on how a life can be lived. And I was like, that is the message, where it's like what you're giving these young college students in America is an opportunity to experience how a different life path can be taken and how that can add to the beauty of what you can bring back in your own community. And that's exactly what they did. Like, they would learn all these really cool things, and they would start their own, like, nonprofits and, you know, community organizations, or some of them would go on to become musicians and learn samba and all these things. And so I'm like, if you communicate that to someone and you say that it was because of my individual experience that I was transformed by the beauty of this place, and I want to pass on that beauty to everyone who is involved in this program, that's going to be far more compelling than here are the numbers, here's this, here's how much money we've raised, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I mean by the current.
You want me to add to that? Trying to think, there's like, so this is my favorite thing, is finding like the gem of the story. I think it ties to a few different things, but one, even before the story and the kernel or the gem, is like, if we get businessy, the audience analysis, like to fully know the avatar of who you're speaking to, who your product's for, who your audience is, do like so much research on that, and then you go into the story interview. So I usually interview these founders for like 3 or 4 hours from birth to now, and we get into so much stuff. And it's often, which I guess would be like my takeaway, it's usually the most like vulnerable, juicy, muddy, weird, I don't want to talk about it thing that is the most powerful connective tissue in your story. And it's always that one line. This one woman I guess was just kind of funny. I used to work with this like pediatrician, mom expert, fitness doctor, and we rebranded her whole thing, and she's like super badass about like teaching moms like tips for self-care, and she's all about fitness. And then like finally after like 4 hours, she's like, oh yeah, like my water broke when I was on the elliptical. And like that's in her story now. And she like loves that too, but she's like a radical pediatrician, mom, doctor, fitness expert. I was like, that's so perfect for what you do. And there's many other gems in what you did. And then another woman I worked with a couple years ago who like runs 6 award-winning businesses in London, went through her whole story. And some people are hard to dig into, but you just gotta keep interviewing. And you may be hard to dig into yourself. So hyper successful, like 20 lists of accolades. Kept digging. I was like, I can't find your like raw, vulnerable thing. And then she told me when she was 17, she's from Ghana, and her father came into the room and said she would never amount to anything in life, and she was like a woman in Ghana. And then her grandmother came in and said, you have my blood, and you're going to be something in this world. And she packed her bags, moved to London, and over the next 20 years, she founded 6 global like award-winning businesses. She's like, now she's back in Ghana, like the head of this angel fund. And like I was thinking that line, I was like, that is powerful. So we put that right, but it took a while to get to that. But it's like those moments, and obviously what she's talking about is very emotional. It's that single line that makes the whole story breathe and like come to life. So finding that little like core vulnerable moment.
I'd like to know if there's any nuance to storytelling, if your audience is, if you're looking for a financial investment from a corporate audience. So that's my avatar, if you will. And so where, you know, emotion may not be the motivator, where bottom line revenue may be the motivator for that audience. Is there any nuance to telling stories when that may be the case?
Yeah, I think painting the picture of like your brand or what you're doing, when people can just look at, say, a timeline or your Instagram, right, and like get a feel for you and or your company, like that's powerful, because then they want to align with you, right? So it's not necessarily a pitch, it's like what's already happening, and they end up being like a partnership. I don't know if that completely answers it, but sometimes you work with brands or people and it aligns, you know, it feels right. And you guys bring it to life even more, you know, than you already kind of started on 2 different sides, right? So I think strategic partnership, and sometimes that can come with investments. When somebody backs you and, you know, kind of puts their stamp of approval on it, you know, other people will take notice.
Are you talking about pitching and like funding and investing?
Well, actually, I'm thinking more in the development space. So, for example, if I were specifically to take a nonprofit client and try to forge a corporate partnership for them to get a corporation to invest in the nonprofit, you know, how to share that story when there are financial stakes at play for the corporation.
Can everyone hear in the back? You can. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to give you mine. Because
Well, give her the mic first.
so I'm going to reiterate the question.
Absolutely.
Right there. So basically, we have an individual who is trying to forge a partnership for her nonprofit that she's working with a corporation, and she's trying to figure out how to tell that story, how to deliver that. Is that fair?
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So, I'd say one fallacy that I've come upon is that sometimes when people are, because I've forged many partnerships with many corporations, several Fortune 500 companies, and I think people often think that corporations are these big, like, faceless behemoths where, like, you have to just, like, you know, throw the money at them and the papers and send the other. Like, at the end of the day, they're still run by people. And so, like, I remember I have a friend who has had many, many successes in terms of forging corporate partnerships. And he would always send them these I thought it was ridiculous back in the day, but he would send these emails that were just like full of like jokes and, you know, just funny references. And he would get a reply, I would say 91% of the time. And oftentimes someone would be like, this is the funniest email I've ever read. Here is my boss who now wants to talk with you. And he was doing more like marketing, copywriting stuff. But I think at the end of the day, what's important to realize is that, and I know a lot of people who are on the receiving end of these proposals. And so when you're getting 100 proposals a day and you're one person, or maybe you're a small team of 2 to 3 gatekeepers, if something isn't standing out in your head, then all these proposals just kind of start to blend together into the same thing. And so I think finding that emotional potency, and sometimes it's not always humor necessarily, but finding that emotional potency, maybe it's something like quirky or unique, or maybe it's researching the person that you're talking to. Like, I had a friend of mine who used to do like corporate consulting, and so he would need to get like a lot of these top executives to come on these programs and like give talks. And he told his whole team, he was like, I want to get Pete Carroll, the coach of the Seattle Seahawks, to be in my program. And everyone just laughed at him. They're like, no, you're never going to get Pete Carroll. He's like, no, I think I can do it. And so he reached out to, you know, some unrelated unrelated department in the Seattle Seahawks, who connected him to this other department who knew a friend of his. So he then followed up with the friend who made a connection to a different department, and then he eventually worked his way up, and he got 3 of the coaching staff eventually after this 2-month process to be a part of it. But it all started because he did deep research on the first person, and he was like, hey, I know you're into this, this, and this. I think that's really cool. I listened to this interview that you did. And he really focused on like, how can you honor the first touch point in the chain? Because if that person doesn't give you the okay to the next person, you're never gonna get anywhere. And so for me, I'm always thinking about like, yes, it's a corporation, but who's the human being behind it? And then I can also, you know, follow up with, here's how I think you'll benefit.
That's actually, I love what you said about really getting into it. Digging deep, researching, learning. I'm working right now with the Navajo Nation, the reservation out in Southwest, and I'm working with an organization that is teaching Navajo farming techniques. And these are 400 plus year old farming and agricultural techniques. And they've been teaching for the last 40 years, but finally they decided to get their presence online, so we helped develop their website. And we were able to forge a relationship and a partnership with MIT. I'm sure you've all heard of MIT. MIT was really interested in the techniques, the technology of the Navajo Nation. Well, the Navajo Nation is just much more than just a technology. It's a culture, it's a society that has persevered through a lot of ups and downs and a lot of adversity. But what we were able to do is really remembering that people at MIT aren't just really smart brains. They are people. They are people who are motivated and moved by changing the world. So what was the story on the website? The story was about this 400-year-old cultural techniques and ways of life that were passed down to people who are now sharing it with the world. And that aspect was the piece that really attracted MIT and said, now we're going to sponsor you, and now you're going to be part of our global technology division on where we're going to share your techniques. And hopefully MIT will piggyback off of that and develop actual techniques that can be shared around the world. But it came through understanding first Navajo farming, telling the story and their end goal, but forming it in a way that many different organizations and people can really digest it. Not in this long, drawn-out story, or I should say, logical reasoning. Because in sales, I'm sure many of you business owners not only do marketing hat for your business, but you have to put on the sales cap. And we always know in sales is first your logic. You share the logic and then you get them emotionally motivated, right? So that you can close the deal. Well, in this case, you share the logic, but you share it through a story. And in bite-sized pieces of information that anyone can take away and get excited. So we were able to really get the story across by understanding that there is people at the end of, on the other side of that screen, they're going to be reading that information. So we really took that approach, and it resonated, and now MIT is one of the partners.
We have time for about one more question. The really cool glasses in the back.
Appreciate it. So I got in this cat late, so if you already covered this, my apologies. I'd just like to hear each of your take on what the best medium you think is for connecting, resonating, and telling your story with either the businesses you work with or your personal story. What the best medium is.
So to reiterate the question, what is the best medium for telling your story?
I'm into photography right now. Like that's my vibe. That's my thing. You know, a picture, they say, you know, speaks 1,000 words. And I really think when you capture like a moment or the essence of a brand in a picture, like it means a lot. You know, billboards still resonate with people. Video is very powerful as well. But I think photos sometimes it's just a little bit easier to get across, but it can be so powerful if you capture that moment or whatever the goal is for that brand, that imagery.
As we use film and music, so I would say that, of course, video, but when you do use video, do not forget the sound, because sound is 50%. If you're using music, make sure that music fits with your story. If you're recording, just use, even if you don't have a fancy equipment, use your cell phone. Just make sure that your sound is clear, and if you're using music, it fits in with your story and transfers the message the same way like the picture does, so that they work together.
I'm sure everyone's going to say video, because video is what's up, and that's what everyone's talking about, whether you're doing it across LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. I think the method is important, which is what you're asking, but I'm going to keep dialing back to that authenticity and like story gem narrative. Because you can have 10 million people posting videos on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, but it's that person who speaks authentically, directly to the camera about their experience and naturally, and maybe with a few story gems in there, that you're going to connect with. So I would even say less so the medium and more so the actual story in such a cluttered space is what you're going to use to connect with people.
What I would say, if we had more time, I would do a quick show of hands, but just think this in your mind, and just raise your hand mentally, but have you listened to a song recently? Have you watched a video recently? Have you looked at a photo? Have you listened to some sort of audio content, the radio, a podcast? Have you watched a movie? I think for most of us, the answer is probably yes to most, if not all of those. Have you read something, an article, a newspaper, a blog? I think the medium that's most important is the medium that communicates your story the most effectively. I know some people who are amazing visual artists, and so that's how they communicate. But if they write, they don't feel as strongly. And I know people who are completely the opposite. And so, back to Brett, like even though we talk a lot about video and these other mediums, like there's a reason why local storytelling events are more popular than ever these days, because we still have that human desire to like gather around the fire and just like listen to each other.
I would say all of the mediums are the best mediums to use. But we have to be realistic, right? We don't have time, we don't have all the budget in the world, we don't have a team, we don't have a video crew. So what you need to do is look at your time, look at how you can tell your story most effectively, and begin to use those mediums. But in a perfect world, you'd want to do a great video with some great audio, telling that story. You'd want to take that video and cut it up into 15-second little Instagram stories or Facebook stories. You would want to take maybe some screenshots or some photos that you took while you were recording, and you wanted to tell a picture story, right? You may want to write a blog that has the video, that has some photos, and it has some great words. You may want to put it on a blog, on a podcast, right? You might want to take that same video and take the audio out of it and post it to a podcast, okay? So what my point is that look at your time. Can you do it all? Do it for that story, okay? But first start with the story and then put all the pieces together. If you are a fantastic photographer, start there and start to venture off into the other worlds of mediums. Only because the more you're able to propagate your story and your message in various different mediums, the more ears and eyes you will attract. So if you really want to benefit and get best results, try to do it all. But if not, start with what you're strongest at and grow from there. But eventually try to tell it in all those different mediums.
One, so, yeah, I think we have 2 minutes. Yeah. Yes.
You all spoke to kind of doing your research and asking, sorry, I'll speak back.
You're fine.
You all spoke to doing your research and kind of asking those questions that lead to the kernel or the juicy part of the story. So I was just curious if you each have a particular question or a couple questions that you feel like have really allowed you to listen for that and will allow that kind of like conversation to start or to reach a greater depth.
So I do the whole like birth to now, which takes a while, which I love. And it kind of, the questions will bounce off of that because I'm listening so intensely. But usually I end with a series of questions which are like, well, let me see which comes through my head. Usually I just like, what are some of the highest high moments of your life and what are some of the lowest low? And that's helpful after 3 hours of their entire life because they start to visualize their entire life ahead of them. And they start to say, oh yeah, like when I was 20 and this happened, or when like my business failed, blah, blah, blah. Like I think I'm a fan of the whole process and then digging into specific points. And it's hard for me to give you an answer because I'm also going as like an interview process, so I'm feeling the inflection of their emotions and their voice. And there was like a time in their life where they started to get more emotional. And I'm like, let's dig in there. Like, are you down to unravel some more? And then we start going, and it's usually, that's why it usually always happens like the last 10 minutes of a long interview process because you have to go through it all. So that's my non-answer.
I think when we speak with entrepreneurs, they are really comfortable talking what they do and how they do it. So just to keep asking why. Anything they talk about, keep asking why. And that's how would be the easiest.
I would say ask yourself questions as well. My new business is a little bit different. It's kind of what I'm feeling in my vibe, and then people join me. So I'm asking myself questions like, how can we elevate this? How can we make a simple brunch cooler? Who can we invite? You know, so it's almost internal for me.
Yeah.
Cool. Question or?
Now let me get a question.
Or a statement.
Speak loud. So I work for an organization, Camper Outdoors, is a nonprofit who is working in the outdoor industry, helping for equity, diversity, and inclusion within the workplace of the outdoor industry. A struggle that we've had is there's a New York Times article called "Who's Allowed to Tell Other People's Stories?" And it was written a couple years ago. And Carlos touched on it, Brenton touched a little bit on this, but basically the article says that if I am not part of this community, if let's say it's an underrepresented or underserved community, am I allowed to tell their story? And how do I do that? That's the question for the panel. When we know that compassion and exploitation can live in a similar space together, and depending on how a story is told, a group could feel that it is exploitation versus compassion. Does that make sense? So coming from an outdoor industry in majority white spaces, how do organizations and brands who live in majority white spaces tell the stories of underrepresented communities and not come across as a new exploitation?
Ouch.
Wow. Invest money, resources, and send people to learn about these people. That's as simple as that. I don't know any other way that you can go and tell about Italy and tell all your friends how great Italy is if you've never been, right? How can you tell someone how amazing saying a specific, for example, Carnaval in Brazil? How can you really speak about it if you've never been there? How can you speak about Brazil if you never spoke to a Brazilian, right? So my answer is, if you're going to attempt to do that and you want some good results, put your money where your mouth is. Send people. Start a little division, a cultural division. Have people of color of those communities on your team, right? Inclusivity, right? Include these people, because unless you've grown up in the South and you're white and you want to talk about the story of the results of Jim Crow, and you're an affluent descendant of plantation owners, you're going to have a very hard time speaking to that cultural group if that is your perspective. So break the ice, destroy the walls, put people on your team, put money into that group, send them out to learn and get recon, right? Get that information so that you can come back and listen with open ears when those stories come back. Don't put your perspective. I love how somebody talked about putting your mind, the saying about your life, and don't cover it up with your mind. Don't cover it up with your own cultural perspective because you own the company, right? Be willing and be open to actually take in that story and try to find your cultural context, your historical context and your experience, and try to find some sort of connection. I think that's the best way that I can answer that.
Yeah, I just want to say, I don't know why I keep using the microphone. I want to say a couple things. So I know we've talked, the thing about diversity, we've talked a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion, and these sort of white majority spaces. And I think this is important to name that this is not about like denigrating white majority spaces. It's just about making sure that there's equity in terms of the kinds of stories that are being told. What I mean by that, to Carlos's point, is that I had a friend of mine reach out to me, some close family friends who are from the Appalachian region, and who are all white, and they basically were like, could you help us kind of make a written and oral history of our different ancestors who come from this region? And I was like, I don't know anything about Appalachian culture. And so I was like, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to have to go there, talk to these people, and like I have a couple friends telling me that they had some grandfathers and great-grandfathers who were like actual hobos, like in the actual hobo culture of living on trains going across the nation in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And I was like, well, I don't know anything about that either. And so I think understanding a story is not just a matter of white dominant culture understanding a non-dominant culture. I think it's about, if you just don't understand the context in which a story comes, going and understanding it. The other way that you can do that is if you don't have the resources or the time or the ability, like, yeah, I would love to, learn about culture in Benin, but I may not be able to afford a plane ticket all the way over there. And so the other way can be, Carlos touched on this a little bit, having a consultant or having somebody who is of that place, that story, that culture, just come and say, hey, I want to tell your story in a way that actually is authentic to your culture, your background, and to you ultimately. So how do I do that effectively? So that might be like, for me, I remember my family's from Congo, and so there was a fellow writer who I was talking to who was writing about Congolese refugees. And she had some character names in this piece that she was writing. And the first thing I told her was, look, Congolese people wouldn't have those names. I don't know where you came up with that, but like, they actually wouldn't be named that. And so like, it's just even little things like that, where, as Carlos was saying, a Cuban might say one thing, but a Puerto Rican may say something else. And so what we're seeing now is that if you go and watch a movie from even like the mid-1900s that depicts a different culture, it's just somebody's fantasy about that culture. But nowadays, that don't fly anymore. And so like they need to, like, I think a great example is Coco. Like I was listening to an interview with the director of Coco, and he was like, we were writing about this place and Mexican culture for like, they'd been working on it for 3.5 years at that point. And he was like, we just weren't getting it right. We weren't getting it right. And so he's like, we had to go to Mexico. We had to get Mexican people on our team so that we could tell a story that's actually authentic. And it took them 4.5 more years to do that. But the result, I think, speaks for itself. That when there are people who are in the room giving voice to that experience, it's going to be a lot more powerful. So that's what I would say.
Agree with both of those. I just have a little addition. So I'm a huge fan of like applying art and creativity to business. And so I study fiction writing, and I always find so many parallels between writing a book and growing a business or working with a business. And like every time I have a lesson about some element of fiction craft, it directly applies to like real life or business stuff. So a big thing in the fiction world right now is sensitivity reading, and like how and can a writer write something from someone else's experience. It's a hugely divisive topic and like a big final question, because people go both ways. It's like, can we just not create characters anymore because everyone has their experience? How do you create other characters in your novel? Or is there a way to respectfully do it? I, and many people, and as we're talking about, think there's a way to respectfully do it. And I think, like you're saying, I think it also boils down to the person, which is integrity, authenticity, leaning towards the side of compassion, because we can all go out and research, or you can hire someone to go out and research, but that person has to be so compassionate and understanding and curious, and also like respectful of the culture. So as they're absorbing it and then creating whatever business assets, that respect and integrity is there. So this author, Christopher Castellani, who I studied with this summer, who's an awesome author, this was a final question. Every fiction class asks this: how do we write other voices? Blah, blah. And so his friend, Rebecca Mackay, is another famous writer. She just wrote a book about gay men with AIDS in the 80s. And all of her friends were like, how are you going to write that? You're not a gay man from the 80s, like you don't know this experience. And she said, and I keep going down this domino of mentor. A mentor of her told Christopher, who told me, to operate your research with a healthy dose of fear. And that's like in a quirky kind of funny way, and it's what Brenton touched on, where if you think you're researching, be a little afraid that you should probably be researching even more. If you're making Coco, and like you think you got a pretty good thing, you might have to do 4 more years of research to get it right. And I think about that with everything now. Like you can do the other voice, but operate your research with a healthy dose of like, I'm not doing enough, maybe I should do another interview, maybe I should go hang out in this neighborhood, maybe I should read 6 more books from this culture to absorb as much as possible. So those are my thoughts.
I would just add the same thing as I said before, that I think we should not be afraid to take on someone else's story, especially if we are approached with it and if we trust them with it. That I had a personal experience a couple months ago. We have this event from our history in our country. It's called Singing Revolution. It's No Blood Was Shed, and that's how we became free from Soviet Union. And I read an article that it's produced in Broadway. So my first thought was like in Broadway, so it's going to be in English, and it was an American producer. But then I needed to think about it, that would I rather not that story be shared, or would I be more curious now to learn about the producer, learn about the crew, learn about the act, and maybe support it? So I would just say that the product will always speak for itself. The product of the story, like we were saying, Coco, the movie spoke for itself. That didn't take anything away from it, but as long as they have support, trust, I think it can be a beautiful thing. And sometimes that culture or that person, or like I said, my country, Estonia, we don't have a producer like this. We don't have anybody on Broadway, so we can't do it ourselves right now, but he can. So when the product comes out, I guess we're gonna see.
So very last thing, how can they get in contact? And 2, where can they see your work? Shameless plug.
Instagram, _Demery_eats and/or_creates.
LiftedOnline.com, and me and my husband, we are right here, right now.
My name's Brett Randell. You can find my music and my writing under that on all the social networks, and then my business is Randell Creative, and that's all like the storytelling for global impact leaders. So yeah, Randell Creative.
So do you mind if I end this with a fun little exercise? Cool. I'm going to hand to Carlos.
Okay. You can find me, my name is Carlos Mireles, and you can find me at blubambu.biz. It's spelled kind of quirky, BLUBAMBU.biz. But if you really want to find me, I have a show on YouTube. It's called Around the Block Talk, Marketing Advice That Works. And we interview different entrepreneurs and we pick their brains about the success in the techniques of marketing that they're implementing. And we talk about storytelling, we talk about cultural relativity, and I encourage you to find me there in case you don't remember the Blu Bambu. Or you could also find me on Instagram at los.worldwide. And I try to share my stories and just inspirational content and what we're up to. So please connect, follow, and you can find content all around there.
For me, you can just find me at Brenton, B-R-E-N-T-O-N, W-E-Y as in Yankee, I as in igloo.com. And I'm the only Brenton way on earth, so not so hard to find me. I would like to...
Before you do that,
yeah.
The commercial that I was talking about is Kiora. I just thought about the very destructive little video or commercial that they did is Kiora, K-I-O-R-A, in case you're looking for it.
Sorry. No, you're good, you're good. Okay, so I have a little fun exercise I'd like to end things with. So, would someone be willing to share with me, just in maybe 1 or 2 words, what is a takeaway that you're going to leave with from our little panel? Yep.
Show people how to live a different life.
Live a different life. And what was your name?
Amy.
Amy? Awesome. Would someone be willing? Would someone be willing to share? In just a word or 2, what is an aspect of your own story that you want to go out and share now with the world?
Vulnerability.
Vulnerability? Awesome. What's your name?
Jilly.
Jilly? That's a cool name. And then, here's a fun one. If you could be anywhere in the world right now, where would you be? Would someone be willing to share that?
Yeah. Singapore.
You say Singapore? You raised your hand twice.
No.
I'll throw you in there as well.
Jamaica.
Jamaica? Oh, that's awesome. Okay. And what's your name?
Celeste.
Celeste. Celeste in Singapore. Have you been before?
Yes.
Okay. It's a good spot. What was your name?
Rhoda. Rhoda.
Rhoda. Awesome. All right. So if everyone could just snap along with me super quick. Somebody's got to tell a little story in the mic. So it's not a bad thing, it's not an intrusion, it's building a world of equity and inclusion. We gather together, we go for unity, bring us together because it's community. Because right now, yes, it's not strife. Amy told me we need to live a different life, and it's all good because we're passing the test. I'll fly to Singapore, you know I'm bringing Celeste, so bringing it back because you know I'm a taker. Rhonda and I, we're gonna be dancing in Jamaica. Thanks so much for coming to our panel. We'll do it in any clothes here, we'll do it in flannel. So we gotta build a better world, tell stories, unite communities, that's how we get our glory. So thank you so much, Vulnerability with Jilly, and it's all good because you know you're thrilling me. So leave with our gratitude, equity, diversion, that is our attitude. So tell stories, write your book, yes, make videos and take a second look. So right now, you've been the best, and right now together we have passed the test. So thank you so much, I told you the best attitude. Leave with the 5 of us with our gratitude.
I just got done speaking on a panel about diversity and storytelling, and it was really a great panel. Some amazing stories, some amazing advice, and I really was honored to be invited here. Olivia was able to invite me. Big shout out to you, and I think we had a really powerful panel, and I hope you walked away with some really great advice and information, and I just really want you to encourage you to continue to explore diversity, explore different stories, different perspectives, because it's really going to help you. It's going to help your business, it's going to help your stories, it's going to help telling and sharing who you are and what you do with the world. And so if you liked this episode of Around the Block Talk, please make sure that you like, and subscribe to the channel so you can get more marketing advice that works.